Okay, this is going to be about the pre-Civil War and about the tension that built up and helped start the Civil War. So let's first go to right before the Civil War. So it's really bad. Secession has been declared by 13 states. War is coming. And so, but everyone knows that the real cause of this war is slavery. If slavery will live on in anywhere, and will it expand to the West? So let's go all the way back to 1787. Discover the root of the problem that has started all this. Slavery. So 1787, slavery was okay back then. No one really cared for any of the slaves. And back then, everything was was more equal. So the government had just promised to return and help any slaves that escaped from slave owners. So they'd help them. The Fugitive Slave Act. And this is 1791 to 1796. 1791, Vermont is admitted as a free state in the U.S. And 1792, Kentucky is admitted as a slave state because there was a delicate balance in the U.S. because for the Senate, there had to be an equal vote of free state and slave states so that there would be a balance. So half of them would vote for everything being free and half of them would vote for a slave so that no one would be unhappy about, hey, they're taking everything's going to be slave now or everything's going to be free now. So they had to have a balance. 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, and that permits the owner of a slave to capture a slave, even if it's in a free state, which is very important for them. In 1794, every single state has banned the slave trade, but not slavery itself. So slaves cannot be brought into the country, though some people did illegally. Later, South Carolina reopened it in 1803. In 1796, Tennessee is admitted as a slave state. 1798 to 1900s. 1798, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, also known as the Nullification Law, were tried. So James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote them, just like a draft thing, which said if the state thought a law was unconstitutional, that they could make it not apply for that state. And so that was going on. But in 1799, George Washington died, and in his will, it said that all his slaves were to be freed. So 124 slaves were freed. And then in the 1800s, In the 1800s, Gabriel Prosser planned a slave rebellion. But information leaked out, and him and 25 of his followers were hanged. So black. And then now 1803 to 1817. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made. Slavery entered the territory, and a lot of people weren't happy about that. And Ohio became a free state. In 1804, all states have abolished or have set gradually abolishing slavery laws. And 1807, Thomas Jefferson, he's still alive, urges Congress to ban the slave trade. And so Congress agrees, and now the slave trade is banned from even South Carolina, which had just recently opened its. And so this is 1811 to 1828. A woman named Martha Cannon was a leader of a gang that kidnapped Maryland slaves and free blacks, and then would sell them to plantations. She was convicted for 4 murders and died in prison awaiting trial. 1812, Louisiana is admitted as a slave state. In 1816, Indiana joins the U.S. as a free state, so it had to have the balance there. And in 1817, Mississippi enters the U.S. as a slave state. 1818 to 1822. Illinois joins as a free state, and Missouri asked Congress to join the U.S. as a slave state, but that would upset the balance, so they didn't have any free states to add. So 3 years of debate went on this. 1819, Alabama enters the U.S. as a slave state. Missouri asked again, but this time the South delays a bill to add another state as a free state. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise is made. It was suggested by Henry Clay. Missouri enters, but Maine enters, so keeping the balance. And also, west of Missouri is illegal and no slaves. But later, the illegal to have slaves past Missouri, it would die out in 1854. And 1820 to 1830, there was another person on the reverse Underground Railroad, which it was called, with Martha Cannon. John A. Murrell had an outlaw gang in Tennessee. He would catch freed slaves. His tactics were to kidnap slaves and promise them freedom, and then sell them back to slavery. And in 1834, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And then 1820 to 1850, John Hart Crenshaw. He was a man who bought a salt works, which still permitted slaves because it was back-breaking work. He kidnapped them and used them in free slave states. He took free blacks, used them in slavery, and his house became known as the Old Slave House and was known to be haunted. In 1822, the Vesey Plot was discovered in South Carolina. Now, the Vesey Plot was a slave rebellion that a man named Denmark Vesey was planning, but it never happened, and he was hanged with 34 followers. And 1830 to 1836. In 1830, North Carolina rules that a slave owner can brutalize any slave they own. In the case North Carolina versus Mann, Supreme Court. In 1831, abolitionists, those are people who don't think that no one should own slaves and that everyone should be free, start demanding freedom for slaves. And then another slave rebellion happens, the Nat Turner Rebellion. 60 whites are killed by the blacks. Then 56 blacks are hanged, and then in the panic that followed, 200 blacks were killed by the mob that followed. In 1832, Andrew Jackson, the president, passed the Force Bill, which permitted the president to use the army in certain situations. And then Virginia tried again to pass the nullification law, which, if you look back, was the one where they could discard any law that they wanted if they thought it was unconstitutional. In 1833, the Compromise Tariff of 1833 was passed by Henry Clay. And the Force Bill and the passed with the resolutions and the nullification law, it pleased both sides and saved a lot of conflict. In 1836, Texas declared its independence from Mexico. Also, Arkansas entered the U.S. as a slave state, and Martin Van Buren became the new president. 1837 to 1847. In 1837, Michigan entered the U.S. as a free state. Yay! And in 1841, the last slave or indentured servant in New York was freed. So no more slaves in New York. And in 1843, 9 states, including Massachusetts, passed laws saying that if a slave came in, that the state officials, like police, couldn't help them capture the slave owners. And in 1845, Florida and Texas both became slave states. And in 1846, the Mexican War began over some property in Texas. And the tension over slavery was building up, and Iowa became a free state there. In 1847, popular sovereignty was introduced, which was a very interesting seeing because Stephen A. Douglas introduced it. And it was that when they made a state, the people inside would take a vote to see if it was slave or free. 1848 to 1849. 1848, Zachary Taylor is named president, and the Southwest Territories became states, including California. Wisconsin becomes a free state, and Zachary Taylor has a more anti-slavery look at things, which made some pro-slavery people mad. And the Oregon Treaty is made with Britain. Now the U.S. gets Oregon. And the Mexican-American War, which was a very fast war and successful one, ends. And in 1849, the California Gold Rush populates California with Northerners. So when popular sovereignty was used, all the Northerners didn't like slavery, so it became a free state. Also, about that time, Harriet Tubman, who's famous, escaped and helped a lot of other helped a lot of slaves escape. She was very important for the Underground Railroad. In the Compromise of 1850. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor died and Vice President Millard Fillmore took his place. But Millard Fillmore was more compromising to the South. So Henry Clay proposed the Compromise of 1850 because there was a lot of tension about slavery in there. And it would say that Texas and New Mexico would become different states because Texaco was trying to be combined with New Mexico. Texas was trying to be combined with New Mexico. But Texas also had a big public debt, and so they would give Texas $10 million to cover it. And they would also use popular sovereignty for those states to decide if they were slave or free. And also South Carolina would ban its slave trade, which had been long getting strays in there. It also provided a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, which got included. And at first it couldn't get passed, and then Stephen Douglas helped it along and got it passed. In 1852 to 1854. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book, was released, which angered a lot of people and opened some people's eyes to the badness of slavery. And Winfield Scott, who became a general, ran for president but didn't make it. In 1853, the U.S. purchased land from Mexico, and this is also known as the Gadsden Purchase. In 1854, Stephen Douglas introduces popular sovereignty again. He wanted to use it for the Kansas and Nebraska, which were going to be new states. It was also called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But then Kansas was flooded with people who wanted to help vote to make it slavery-free. And that made a lot of fights in there. 1855 to 1858. 1855. Kansas is filled with tons of people who are fighting each other. Anti-slavery people try to make constitutions for it to make it free. Excuse me. 1856. Pro-slavery people go to Lawrence, Kansas, and sack it. John Brown goes and gets revenge and murders 5 pro-slavery leaders. James Buchanan became the new president. In 1857, the Supreme Court decided that the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. They decided that a slave could never be a citizen. I'm going to give a little more detail on that because that was a very important decision. Dred Scott and his wife were blacks, and they sued for freedom in St. Louis because their master died and they were in a free state, and so they were claiming freedom. There were 3 trials. The first one in a lower court said no. The second one said yes, and then it got to the Supreme Court. But they decided no. They said a former slave could never be a citizen. And Abraham Lincoln believed that this decision was not right. This greatly added to the tension building up between the North and the South. 1858, Kansas finally became a free state. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas began having their famous debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. James Henry Hammond claimed that Europe completely depended on the South because of the cotton, and so he called the South King Cotton. Minnesota became a free state. 1859 to 1860. 1859. Oregon finally became a free state because of popular sovereignty, but there were no blacks allowed, slave or free. In the Ableman versus Booth case, the Supreme Court decided that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was constitutional. Later, John Brown raided Harper Ferry, an armory in Virginia. He was planning a slave uprising, but Marine Robert E. Lee stopped him before he could do anything. He was hanged. 1860, Lincoln speaks out against slavery, and the Democratic Party slips up with tons of different candidates. So eventually, Stephen Douglas finally became their candidate, but Abraham Lincoln won, and 13 the states planned succession. They do it. War is near. The end. I hope you enjoyed.